Mohammed, I wanted to, even for myself, when I'm coming into this discussion today, it's, and I've had this when I've had Indigenous leaders, this feeling of almost, uh, for lack of a better word, a feeling of dread of asking the wrong question, just kind of like I just did, asking it completely backwards and coming off that, I don't care or I'm completely ignorant to something that's going on. And I know that's a feeling that people have. I'm sure you've seen it. And being a part of DIAC, you're actually at the forefront of bringing this conversation. Do you see people now, though, are much more comfortable having the conversation about just talking about diversity or lack thereof in either their organizations or in the industry itself?
Jerrod, you picked a question that I'm going to be going on for a while because this is my passion about communication. Um, in touching about communication, the nuts and bolts to me is that I still find people are afraid to ask the wrong question.
Mm,
And it's really about appreciation versus appropriation. People don't know where that line sits. We talk about I believe we were talking about in our one of our indigenous group sessions, we had one of our indigenous leaders talking right before Halloween, talking about what to dress up as and what would be deemed as inappropriate and appropriation. But then there's some parts that is appreciation, whereas you can use certain indigenous jewelry and that's okay. Now, what that left us all with was we are all still afraid to ask the question. And it's because we're afraid that we're going to be insulting someone or saying something incorrect. And that's why I do believe that it ties into that symbolism as well. Starting the symbol, basically, you've put out the beacon, if with or without strategy, that you're open for the conversation. You've put out the bat signal to say, I'm here to learn. I have lots more to learn about it, and I want to talk about it, and let's open it up. To me, it's way easier. And as a person of ethnic minority, I know there's going to be questions. Sometimes I just have to get into it right away, or I try to create that environment. And that's the challenge we all have to do as individuals in our companies to create a platform for communication, make sure that it's not coming from a bad place. I think generally people aren't coming in from a bad place. They just want to know. When an incident happens, you want to ask somebody, but you don't want to offend them. Unless you have a close friend that you can talk without judgment, it's very difficult for the average person. And I still think that we have a way to go. We are still afraid to ask. I know I get afraid to ask about certain things all the time just because I don't want to offend. So I'll go and try to do research. And that's, to me, the crux of the problem, the dialogue. And that's why things like this, sessions here, and I'll openly say as a person that I welcome those dialogues, and most people will if it's coming from the right place.
Can you kind of, and I'll put this to both of you, because I think that is a very nice answer. Can you get the sense when somebody is asking a question from ignorance, as in ignorance that they really don't know, or as in ignorance that they're coming with a very clear bias that they've got some sort of agenda behind the questions they're asked? Can you sense it from a mile away? Because I've seen these questions and I can sense no, there's something a little behind this. There's an attitude or an extra layer or something. Can you sense it pretty quick,
Go for it, Teresa.
Teresa?
Yeah. So I love what we're talking about here, and I think I'm like more where I'm like, we can talk about this for hours. But you know what it makes me think of? It makes me think of microaggressions, right? So I don't know if you've ever had this, Jerrod, where somebody might say something to you like, I don't want to come across racist, but, and it's
But I'm about to.
usually right. But so usually those but moments are those like, oh my gosh, or somebody, So to your point, Jerrod, let's be honest, like I'm not psychic. And I also am a person who's a strong believer in not creating stories. So what I mean by that is I don't like to make inferences. If you ask me a question, I typically take everything at face value. The reason is I think it's the safe way of approaching life, um, work, or anything really. Because if you start assuming intent
Yeah.
that's negative, it's just a danger. I mean, how do you know, right? How do I know that you frowned a certain way because maybe you have a nervous tick in your eye? I don't know. So you got to be really careful about supposing an understanding of where the other person's coming from. Um, However, I do know that by studying the idea of microaggressions is that you can listen for certain words, right? Like I said, the very statement, and I'm sure people who are listening to this might have heard this in their own personal lives, where somebody approaches you with something they're about to drop that is just not going to be right, and they preface it, and then the but ends in something that they ought to know better. So yeah, so to your question, Jerrod, I personally trust in positive intent is my first go-to vice. And I love when a curious mind approaches me. And to be honest, while I agree that people should definitely try and do some research, Google something, YouTube it, but I have empathy for those who don't research things and want to have a dialogue. But I would say the best practice is, please, if you're very curious about a topic, try and it's advice for myself as well. Try and do a little bit of research first, see what reputable news articles are saying about it, or platforms, Harvard Business Review, or reports that different companies have put out, and then ask the question for clarification, right?
Yeah, I think what you said is, and that assumption, and I'm actually bad for that myself, just in my own personal life, is where I put a layer on something. I try to figure out where someone's coming up from rather than just going it straight down the middle. And I watched an interesting thing. I believe they were actually FBI agents, and they were saying, like, you cannot tell. They were actually walking through how you could not tell. I think they were specifically looking at spies or something like that. And they said, like, nervous ticks and like people looking the other direction and stuff. They said you can't, because everybody has different reasons for doing that in different backgrounds. I remember in my family, when my sister had brought people from actually around the world, and we were in our family, because we grew up in the country, and we were looking back, it's so funny, but we were having these internal discussions of like, okay, how do we say this? We didn't know. There was no ignorance behind it of, we just didn't know what to say. And that people, I do see people that are so good at it when they're not putting that assumption, like you just said, Theresa, and they do cut through either those nerves or the confusion, and then it becomes a really good dialogue, which is why I'm glad, like, this conversation, I wouldn't do this interview if it was 5 minutes. I couldn't do it, because it's just not enough time to actually get past the layers of just trying to feel out the conversation first.